Whatalofa to it's Tim Tafunga here. It's Saturday evening, 1st of March, right here in Brizzy. Uh, just need to share a bit with the interesting Trump and Zelensky discussions that occurred earlier on today, which is quite interesting considering the position of Australia and the Pacific regarding the Ukrainian war. Now, this is quite interesting because as an Australian and a Pacific Islander, the impacts of what occurs in Europe impacts upon us, and in particular with the current global repositioning and a paradigm shift that's been occurring throughout the world, especially with the geopolitical tectonic plates, seismic shifts that has been occurring has left a very indelible impact on our perceptions of how our world leaders are leading and making decisions on our behalf throughout the world. Interestingly, recently our Prime Minister of Australia had just spoken to made an address to the nation regarding the fallout of the today's earlier discussions between the Ukrainian president and the POTUS Trump. As it turns out, it was something that I personally had expected to occur from the standpoint of the Operation Humpty Dumpty from NATO's response to the current situation in Ukraine. If we could just for a moment not have a goldfish memory of history insofar as understanding the impacts of the Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika, which resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, as we were very familiar with in 1989, which would subsequently lead to the establishment of the Bucharest Nine, who would therefore join NATO, who were former members of the Warsaw Pact. In that particular moment in time, as the fallout of the Cold War, we saw the nascent rise of the new Bucharest Nine member nations, who were very noted with their supplies of Su-27s and T-72 tanks to the Ukrainian military in their war and response to the special military operation incursion by Russia in February 24th, 2022. Now, from an historical context, which we need to understand what the ramifications of past events, historical events, such as the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, the impact was the creation of the Ukrainian nation in 1991. All right. Now, the creation of the nation of Ukraine in 1991 would also include encompassing East Ukrainian territories, which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, peopled by no less than the Russian people, Russian-speaking Slavics, who populated the Kharkov, the Lugansk, and the Donetsk oblasts, as well as Crimea. Now, what we need to understand is the context of the domestic political sphere, which is the people that live there. Now, the people that live in the Donetsk regions and the Donbass region, as it were, historically, were always Russian people. They went to Ukrainian speakers, they were Russian speakers. Now, if you understand just a smidgen of Russian history, uh, even from the Stalinist period, right up until the Gorbachev perestroika and glasnost periods, you would understand that whilst these geopolitical boundaries were changing, with sovereignty, national boundaries were changing, the people that were remaining in those regions were still Slavic Russian people. As it turns out, we all know the obvious, right? Now, we need to look in retrospect as well to the period of time in which Crimea itself was ceded to the Ukrainians after a pork barrel promise by the election campaign for the presidential campaign of the successor of Joseph Stalin after his passing in 1953. In 1954, in order to win an election, the pork barreling with the Ukraine Republic, Soviet Republic, was made by none other than Nikita Khrushchev, whom had in 1954 gave Crimea to Ukraine. So from 1954 onwards, all of a sudden, the memories of 100 years earlier, when the last crusade of Europe, which was to get rid of the Ottoman Empire by the Tsar of Russia, didn't work out. So that led to the French and the British joining forces with the Ottomans to fight to repel the Tsar of Russia and the war of, which was subsequently known as the Crimean War in 1853. In 1853, it was known as Russian. All right, with the charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Alfred Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade was charging down the track in between the Russian guns. It wasn't Ukrainian, it was Russian guns. So if you would regale the charge of the Light Brigade and the movies that was made from that, they were fighting the Russians. 100 years later, that Russian area, oblast called Crimea, was given to the Ukrainians. Now, even in World War II, it was always the Russians. So Operation Barbarossa in 1941 through to 43, the German Sixth Army of General Paulus and the Sixth Army and the Wehrmacht had attempted to take Crimea from the Russians. It wasn't the Ukrainians, it was the Russians. And right up until, unless you got a memory of a goldfish, the history of the region is always Russian. All right. So the Black Sea Fleet is Russian, and it may be called the Soviet Union, but still it's Russians. All right. They always were Russian people. Now, all of a sudden, the history of Ukraine and Russia only starts from 1991. And everyone's talking about, Russia aggressively invaded Ukraine. Not the fact that Russia was liberating the Donetsk People's Republic or the Lugansk People's Republic, who were Russian people. So, although the real factual essence of the sociological history of the region is that the original inhabitants, and still are, were Russian people, that's beside the point. Because apparently, according to this Cold War and NATO narrative, it's Ukraine, and they're meant to be Ukrainian speakers. Now you can go through YouTube and look through the battles of the Ninth Brigade, whatever that was, the 93rd Battalion that was fighting in Lugansk regions. They were fighting and encountering Russians, and these people were from the LPR or the DPR, and they were locals, and they only spoke Russian. When they were encountered by Ukrainian roadblocks, they spoke to the locals, who spoke to them in Russian. They spoke to them in Ukrainian. The locals said, "We don't understand you. We speak Russians." And they said, "Where are you from? You're from Russia." And they said, "No, we're from Lugansk." And there's actual footage of them saying that. And up until 2022, everybody ignored that, even though we all know, historians like us and political scientists whom are qualified as political scientists like myself, we know the history of the region, and we've studied the military history of the region. So we would always talk about it. So subsequently, these relevant historical facts are ignored, only to the point that it is relevant for those who think that it's relevant for the current narrative. Now, the Australian Prime Minister said that the aggressor is Russia, who invaded Ukraine. Now, you got to realize, if you got to understand the local context, if I could make a comparison, it is likened to say that Samoa was once ruled by the Tongans, and I'm a Samoan, and I'm saying, like, we got rid of the Tongans. And even though the Tongans say it's their territory, it's not their territory, it's ours. We spoke Samoan. It's like the Russians, they only speak Russian. And people would say that's Ukraine, and you got to speak Ukrainian, and you got to be assimilated to the Ukrainian culture. Now, that's like saying the Tongans were telling the Samoans, you got to speak Tongan. If you don't speak Tongan, we're going to kill you. And that's exactly what happened in the Donbas region, whereby the Ukrainians were repressing the Russian people who have always lived there, and they've always said they were Russian people. On September 27th, 2022, the Donbas and Crimea and Kherson had conducted their referenda. The locals won. They voted to join the Russian Federation. On October the 3rd, 2022, the Duma of the Russian Parliament in Kremlin ratified the inclusion of the 5 former Ukrainian oblasts back into the Russian fraternity and became part of the current Russian Extension Federation. Now, that is lost, and it is remiss of the people who are all pro-Ukrainian. Now, that brings us up to date. Recently, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of England, had recently, Britain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, went to Kiev, signed a 100-year deal to secure the minerals and ports, Odessa, that includes Odessa, for the British. Now, that minerals deal was already signed by Zelensky and Keir Starmer. That's a 100-year deal. That's like Hong Kong. So we've got another Hong Kong in Ukraine with the British. Now, the British are good at that diplomacy, that gift to establish political allegiances with signing pens. It's like how they signed the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand before they had the war. But that's what the British do. As soon as they realize that they're not numerically strong or militarily strong, they would shove a pen and paper, get you to sign a contractual arrangements, which it would be called a treaty of some sorts. They do that all over the world. Now, they did that with the Maoris of New Zealand. They'll do that with anyone that they consider kind of equal to themselves, and especially in a civilization that they could acquire what they want in such cases, such as resources, natural resources. So, interestingly, President Trump had arranged for rare earths to be acquired from the Donbas region. Now, most of the rare earths is located in the recently acquired uh, uh, Donbas region mines, which has the titanium and lithium that the United States needs for their military applications and their electric vehicles for the Telstra, oh yeah, Teslas, and for old Rasputin, Elon Rasputin Musk. So what you have is the the situation where the British have already signed the mineral deal before President Trump had time to deal with it. So what do? You go over to America, you try to sign another deal and be a two-face with Great Britain. The British go over first, then followed by by President Zelensky. And so these guys sort themselves out. Now, recently, Australia just announced their loyalty to Ukraine after that debacle of a discussion between the uh, the uh, uh, the president of Zelensky and President Trump. That debacle resulted in the schism within NATO. Now, NATO, you have 17 nations that are meeting tomorrow in a couple of minutes on March the 2nd. March the 2nd and Sunday in London, where they're going to discuss this matter. More than likely, the British are trying to deploy troops as peacekeepers in a demilitarized zone within Ukraine as part of this demilitarized peace deal, assuming that NATO has the position of strength, which is utter rubbish. And most likely, the French and the British troops deployments is not going to work unless you really want World War III, in which case you will lose anyway. So, with the current fallout between Zelensky and Trump, the most likely outcome would be Zelensky would be the next president of Ukraine. More than likely, he'll win an upcoming Ukrainian election. President Trump would much rather speak to a general rather than a comedian. So, as president of Ukraine, Zelensky, the current ambassador to England, would be the favorite to negotiate a peace between the bellicose parties. Now, at this moment in time, more than likely, we will see the likelihood of a Zelensky administration coming into Ukraine probably at the end of 2025, if we don't end up in World War III. But Zelensky, I'd say, is the favorite to be considered as the next president. Sersky, no. But I think Zelensky will be. He's given a lot of positives for the Ukrainians. A lot of them are dead now because the Russians sorted them out mainly with Fab 3000s and Fabs that's just wiped out all of the loyal Zelensky fighters, especially within Avdiivka and Bakhmut. But that's the way things are. So I suspect Zelensky would take the reins, and when you're meeting in London, you're going to have to talk about that. And I think Zelensky should be in charge of the discussions on behalf of Ukraine. Zelensky, mate, go back to your comedies, mate, and you can do your dress ups, because obviously you failed the fashion stakes, and knowing your position of power, and you dress for the appropriate occasion. You don't dress appropriately, and you're going to get people that's going to dislike you. You know, we've seen your comedic skits, and mate, you will make people laugh. I know you're a Benny Hill fan. I laughed at it when I was a kid, but as you grow older, you look at Benny Hill, you don't laugh at things like that. It's a bit crass, but you know that's what you are. We know what you are, and you're better off. You're better off in that. You know that's that's where you should be, and leave politics to the grown-ups, and you shouldn't be wanting to continue this war of attrition. It's just a war of attrition, and it's succeeding only in one thing. It's that it's succeeding in denazifying the Ukrainians, neo-Nazis. That's is probably the only positive from a Putin special military operation standpoint, because there is a physical denazification of the Ukrainians and even some Nazis within the Navalny fans and Prigozhin fans of the Russians neo-Nazis. There's quite a few of them. So we know that as well. So from this standpoint, looking from an Australian point of view, we could have a fallout between AUKUS. You may not even get your submarines, and you will not get your AUKUS SSNs because of this situation where President Trump is looking at Australia and Great Britain, say, mate, AUKUS, what's the use? This Anglo-American treaty and alliance, it goes along the lines of Anglo-American racism and colonialism. As far as Pacific Islanders are concerned, we can see it's just all these Anglo-Canadian and Americans, past colonial history that has been revised via Scott Morrison here in Australia and AUKUS, and then you get your AUKUS deal that is a tough deal, and and it's going to cost you billions of dollars, and you're going to end up losing out in the end because Americans are building 2 Virginia SSNs for every 7 Type 093Bs SSNs that the Chinese are building. All the fact that the Chinese 095 SSNs are coming up the assembly lines twice as fast than the Block 5 Virginia class SSNs here in Australia. And, Australia, for that matter, are trying to get up there, the frigate Hunter class type, type 45 or type 26 British made BAE made frigates, and they're 11 general purpose frigates and 6 Losos, those large special vehicles, whatever, and the 3 Hobart class destroyers, which I think is almost combat ineffective, especially against the Chinese. They are, churning out warships and submarines faster than you could say that you've got 1 Astute class SSN or 1 Virginia class SSN. Mate, you're way behind the 8 ball. So whilst these Chinese Type 055 destroyers and the Type 054A frigate was cruising along, circumnavigating Australia and making you all panic, especially New Zealand, the fact is the weapons loadout of those 2 Chinese vessels is so formidable that they could sink the entire Anzac-class frigates all at once. That's the amount of YJ-21 hypersonic missiles, anti-ship missiles, that especially the Type 054A loader, weapons loader, has. They could sink all of those frigates even before they even knew what hit them. Now, they'll sink them, and they would have detected the Collins-class SSK before they even got near to launch a Mark 48 torpedo. That's how more advanced the Chinese are with their sonar and their radar systems, with their Type 346 radar detections. They're more advanced. And that's simply because rare earths. You see, the Chinese have 90% of the world's gallium and unique gallium nitrate for superior radar systems. Now, America hasn't got that. Now, America is short on rare earths. Where do you get rare earths? You go to China. China produces 65% of the highest quality lithium. For the highest quality lithium processing is processed in China. Also, 90% of the world's batteries, from alkali to especially lithiums, is processed in China. Finally, gallium, germanium, antimony, rare earths are all processed in China. So, from that standpoint, America, NATO, you're way behind the eight ball. Okay, on that note, I've had enough. You've had enough of me as well. That's enough for now, all right? Yeah, Maria Tato, and all these Samoans in your politics, your Kirikiki Samoa politics. I haven't got time for you people. Goodbye.